Hello everybody, and welcome to this session with Richard Nash. And I'm just so proud to have Richard here for the first time in the Middle East. And this session will be part of the ADIBF Academy Future Proof Publisher, because that's what Richard leads with, the future publishing. He's actually been named one of the 5 people most likely to change future publishing forever, and the #1 Twitter user influencing the world of publishing. So I'm really looking forward to the speech.
Thank you. This, not yet. Maybe I'll use this until. There we go. Okay. I'm flexible. A lot of what I'm going to try to do right now and try to understand where publishing is and where publishing is going is by looking at the past. Ironically, in publishing, which is an endeavor which is very much about taking all the accumulated store of human knowledge and distributing it, people who work in publishing often have a very short historical perspective. And I want to try to correct that a little bit, and in doing so, try to point out some of the principles that I think will be active as books and book culture and publishing progresses over the next 500 years. One of the interesting things about publishing and about writing is that the point in human history when a writer was guaranteed an income, the only point in human history when a writer could be certain of making money was before printing. Because the writer was the machine for reproduction. Typically, the writer was paid by religious authorities or political authorities to transcribe the iconic literature and the key pieces of information that were necessary for society to exist. Whether it was information about God, or information about agriculture, or information about how the sun moved around the world, or the world moved around the sun, this guaranteed a writer income. And the printing press actually ended up destroying all that. The printing press destroyed writing 1.0, and brought us effectively publishing 1.0. And in publishing 1.0, the writer was actually no longer guaranteed an income. In a sense, the printing press put writers out of business. However, the writer got something back in exchange for that, which was that the writer was now, within reason, allowed to write what he or she wanted. Right? For the first time, the printing press took away their ability to make money, but gave them the ability to express themselves. And once you put together the ability to express yourself with the technology required to reproduce that at some scale, you got writing 2.0. One of the interesting aspects of writing 2.0 is that instead of being like a monk in a medieval scriptorium, sitting down, facing your desk, transcribing words that were not yours, you got the printing press, which on the one hand, you think of as an industrial activity, but in its early phases was actually a very social activity. At the printing press, everybody's kind of hanging out. It's the first glimpse of something like a book fair, where publishers and writers and editors gathered to argue, discuss, inspire, transform. And in that particular situation, you also start to see the beginning of retail. Because the very first printing presses were also publishers and were also retailers. It's where you went to get your book printed, it's where you went to go buy a book. But over the course, and now I'm sort of shifting into a somewhat more Western-centric history, but I will do my best to try to contextualize it or limit it or bracket it in such a way that there is scope for people to be able to contrast that with a variety of different models. In the 18th century, you have the beginning of retail, and this is not just the beginning of book retail. This is the beginning of retail overall. The first time in human history when a consumer was allowed to browse and explore and touch and open up, or to be attracted by the packaging, was in books. Books were the invention of modern retail. Before that, you went up and you asked for a certain amount of sugar and 5 pounds of flour and 10 apples, and a person went into the back room and came out and put it all on the table and you just took it. Books were the first time you have the idea of the consumer as having a certain amount of agency, as being able to make choices. And that, over a period of several hundred years, maintains its social activity, just like the slide before of the printing press. There's an opportunity for people to meet and argue and have conversations around literature, around society, around culture and politics. But at that particular point, you also start to see business models begin to arise. And the very first, one of the very first instances of the subscription models, which we were discussing earlier today, is the British poet Alexander Pope, who wished to do a new translation of Homer's Iliad. And to do this, he did not want to rely on the patron. Typically, writers would either rely on a patron, some person of immense wealth who wanted to prove his cultural authority by giving money to writers to write books, or, per the previous slides, through publishers who would take the risk. But in this instance, the author decides to take the risk himself by writing to hundreds of people and saying, "Give me 2 guineas, and I will translate and have printed the Iliad." In the West now, this gets called crowdfunding. This is the original Kickstarter. Is Alexander Pope wanting to have published the Iliad. But it does remain an individualized activity. We're barely at the point of real industrial revolution scale publishing. But we're already starting to see a proliferation of business models, a retail business model, a direct-to-consumer subscription model. But over the course of the 18th and 19th century, basically the printing press gets attached to steam engines. And all of a sudden, you're not just relying on human beings to move these machines. You have a mass market, you have high volume activity. And that's occurring not just at the level of reproduction, where you're going from the ability to produce 50 copies a day to 500 or 5,000 physical copies a day. But you are also starting to see other aspects of Western Industrial Revolution infrastructure developing. So this happens to be a book, a memoir, of a classic publisher sales rep in the late 19th century. And the most interesting thing to my mind is, oh my God, my emails are popping up there at the top. Well, you're going to see what emails I get over the course of today. Privacy is also something that is evolving in the 21st century, is it not? So 20 years by stage and rail. And what happens is these sales reps are traveling around the United States, which meant they were taking advantage of 19th century infrastructure. The ability to take very large numbers of things, like books, but also then move them great distances. And to do so in a relatively cost-effective, high-volume way. It has in fact been argued that the very first Amazon was in fact Sears, an American department store which used the advent of four-color printing and inexpensive printing in the late 19th century to create massive catalogs. And they would create these 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 page catalogs containing things like agricultural implements, shoes, women's garments, almost everything you could buy on Amazon right now. You could actually buy from the Sears Roebuck catalog in 1882, except you would have to wait maybe 3, 4, 6 weeks for it to come to you. But nevertheless, we're talking about massive industrial scale distribution, which also therefore puts more pressure to find more outlets. The more you can create, the more places you need to find to be able to sell it. And so you have the founder of Penguin is nowadays treated as a tremendously important cultural figure, the inventor of Penguin Classics. But at the time, Alan Lane was treated in much the same way that many people treat Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon, as a thug, as a person who doesn't care about literature, as a purely commercial person, because he put Penguin paperbacks in vending machines at the train stations. He wanted to make books as cheap and convenient to buy as a pack of cigarettes. And so he put them in all the places where you could buy a pack of cigarettes. It was the Penguincubator. And he was treated really as a barbarian for having done so. So from early 1500s of writing 2.0, I've now jumped all the way to the same picture, but a different time period. In 1985, a company begins with software called PageMaker. And PageMaker is the beginning of desktop publishing software. And quite beautifully, they named it after a Venetian printer, Aldus Manutius. And it is in fact his image that I used rather than Gutenberg's to illustrate the early history of printing, partially because Aldus was tremendously commercially successful, whereas Gutenberg went bankrupt. And I think it's always nice to emphasize that one could make money in publishing, despite how difficult it may sometimes seem. The other interesting thing about Aldus is that he invented things like italics, which was critical in the Roman alphabet. The semicolon, he invented more and more punctuation, because as language went from something spoken to something written, you needed to be able to apprehend the rhythm of speech more naturally, which required punctuation. And Aldus also invented what was effectively the first paperback, the octavo, the ability to carry a book around with you. And what the people who created PageMaker turned to when they wanted to name their company. So what I've described from writing 1.0 in early medieval times up until now is basically a series of dramatic, although incremental, improvements in our ability to increase the supply of books. Almost everything that I've described has been a supply-side innovation. How do we make more books? I've even skipped over periods in the 50s and 60s and 70s when tremendous innovation was going on in the West in the publishing supply chain. Book publishers actually invented just-in-time inventory before Toyota. In the early 1970s, the wholesaler Ingram was printing all its inventory on microfilm and mailing the microfilm to bookstores so that bookstores would know how much inventory the wholesaler had, so that they didn't need to order too many copies from the publishers up front. They knew if they sold the 5 copies they'd gotten from the publisher, that Ingram would have another 3 or 5 or 20 copies that they could order. So those elements of infrastructure, which I know in conversations I've had here, feel very lacking in other countries' book industries, have been tremendously advanced in the United States, not just advanced relative to books, but advanced relative to every other element of capitalism. In many respects, the story I'm telling here is not just a story of incremental improvements in the book industry, it's the story of the invention of the Industrial Revolution itself and of the invention of modern capitalism. That books are not sort of this quiet, arbitrary, idiosyncratic, uncommercial activity. They're actually at the center of the commercial revolution in the West. Now, the key thing, of course, is that with PageMaker, you start to see the beginning of the end of the Industrial Revolution mode of producing books. But as with every beginning of an end, it represents also its apotheosis. This is the moment at which anyone can create a book. For the first time in human history, I could make a file that was identical to the I could make a facsimile, I could make a proof that was identical in quality to what Random House or Bonniers could do. Now, I still had to pay for the reproduction, but nevertheless, it is the first time in history any human being can make a perfect model of anything, that the industry almost is now in the house. Like with the revolution around consumer 3D printing that gets talked about a lot, the very first 3D printing is Apple's laser writer. Now, with this comes a challenge, because each time you improve supply, you have to figure out, well, where's the demand? And it turned out that basically it took the West about 500 years to create enough supply to where they started bouncing up against the limits of demand. So over the course, in 1980, 8,000 books published in the United States. 1990, 35,000. So a fourfold increase over 40 years. And then from 1990 to 1997, it quadrupled again. This is the number of ISBNs, and this is print books. So the number of print books, individual SKUs, individual ISBN created over 7 years quadrupled. And what's interesting is that over the next 7 years, it only doubled. And after that, it only increased by 10%, 15%. So this is basically a kind of a super accelerated version of what we've seen over 500 years, which is the ability of a society to produce an almost unlimited number of books, to basically take production issues away from the issue of self-expression. And this is before the internet, or effectively it's before the internet. All these are print books. Now, the interesting thing is to look at another medium right now, which is to look at music. Because the thing with, slide didn't move. The thing with music is that it is reversed. In music, the first digital innovation in music was at the level of listening rather than producing. In books, we created the PDF in 1985. In music, however, the first format innovation is the MP3 in 1993. And it's not until 12 years later that the world of music is able to give the average person the ability to produce the music equivalent of a PDF. So the reason why publishing seems to be behind is simply that our innovation was on the supply side, and it's not until the Kindle in 2007 that you have the ability to start, for consumers to start to be able to read digitally. And so at that particular point, things go 32 million titles published in the United States last year. At that point, books and readers and writers start heading toward a 1-to-1 ratio. And so what it suggests, and I realize with this particular slide, it's not just the 20th century is about sorting out supply. It's really been the last 500 years that are about sorting out supply. But the real challenge is to figure out demand. And how do we look at that? What are some of the ways in which we can think about demand? Because the reason I emphasize this too is that there is an opportunity for societies, for cultures, for regions that did not have this sort of spectacular industrial revolution with 50,000 miles of rail and elaborate wholesaler infrastructures and population densities that would allow for retail to stack 10, 15 stories high in large metropolises. There is an opportunity to not actually have to do all that stuff, to skip, as many cultures have to skip basically the equivalent of fixed line telephony and go straight to mobile, to skip the steam engine and go straight to the electric car. And focusing on demand, not just supply, although there is obviously still ongoing work to get done around supply, but to think of it not just in terms of supply, but also with demand is something that I think is really a magnificent opportunity in economies like this region. Now, in the United States, the demand side problem over the last 15 or 20 years could be represented by a woman named Oprah Winfrey. And Oprah Winfrey is an American talk show host who was fond of books and launched a book club where she would encourage her viewers to read a particular book that they would then discuss amongst themselves, and she would discuss on television. And when Oprah picked a book, you could be sure that it would sell an extra 1 to 3 million copies. So it was considered magic, and it was the power of television. Oprah was viewed as the savior of publishing. We are now producing so many books, how the hell are we going to be able to sell them all? Oprah will be our savior. She will sell all of them for us. And I think that reflected a real error in understanding of what Oprah was doing and what Oprah meant, because I would argue that books were as important to Oprah as Oprah was to books, because she recognized she was on television 1 hour a day. And yes, she had the audience in the palm of her hands from 3 o'clock until 4 o'clock. But then there was somebody else on TV, and then there was something else, and then there was the news, and then there were the dramas, and it wasn't until next day that she got her audience again. And she was only able to speak to them. They didn't speak back. But when she started a book club, her vision of books and the conversation she wanted to have about love, shame, family, guilt, all the big, juicy, emotional topics that came up in her show, could be with her audience 24 hours a day. Oprah was able to go into the cafeteria with them at work, at the dinner table with their family, into the bathroom if you read sitting on the toilet, into the bed if you're in the bed. Oprah was with her audience 24 hours a day. It was a way to begin to own her audience's minds. And because they read books and discussed them with one another, it was an opportunity for people to talk to one another about topics that were very private, very intimate: adultery, death, suicide, topics that are highly emotional, very awkward for people to be able to speak about directly to one another out of their own personal experience. But through the proxy of the characters in the books, you can talk about these topics and feel connected to your fellow men and women without getting quite as risky. So Oprah basically became a nation's psychotherapist via books. And so the intimacy that books offer was the critical dimension of what Oprah picked up on. It was the conversation that books enabled. Books as social glue. Now, the other person I want to point out who's very un-Oprah-like is Jose Luis Borges, the Argentinian writer and librarian, who in all his books was focused not just on telling stories, but on how every story is connected to every other story. How every unit of knowledge connects to other units of knowledge. How you could even imagine in one of his stories/essays a map of the world that had such detail it was the size of the world itself. That all the connections that exist between people are effectively a kind of internet of the mind. And what he realized, therefore, is that the book is not some container that is fixed. A book contains worlds, and all books contain worlds, and all those worlds are connected to one another. But they are, in a sense, like web pages that can be linked, if only in the imagination. But now we know they can all be linked. And what I would suggest this means, therefore, is that the kind of social glue that Oprah focused on, and the kind of immense network of interconnected cultural reference that Borges functions on, is the core of where we see the book as being powerful in our society, and where the demand actually comes from. Now, effectively, thinking of books as being a kind of a thing about which we have a conversation, and that conversation is effectively culture. And so we need books in order to be in culture, because we need something to talk about, something to argue about, something to serve as proxies for our own identity. And the reality is that we are not there yet, right? These are two things that I think can be governing principles for what the future of generating demand for books looks like. But we're at very, very, very early phases of actually executing against that. In many respects, or in certain respects, Amazon does already represent the Borgesian fantasy of a library of every book. They've been tremendously successful at solving the selection problem. How do we get all the books in the world in one place? But what they're somewhat limited in is in figuring out how they all connect to one another. And there's been the main move that has been made to try to handle the hundreds of millions of cultural artifacts we're now capable of making, and those people who might want to read, see, watch them, has been the algorithm, right? It's one thing to walk into a bookstore with 8,000 copies that are organized by category and to just go in and browse. It's a fairly human-sized experience that's relatively easy to do that. We've all learned to do that. We can even do that in a place as big as here. But when you have 32 million artifacts, when you have 100 million songs and tens of millions of books, how do you do that? And the way Amazon and a lot of contemporary technologists try to go about doing that is algorithms. And so what you see here is a flock of more than 1 million starlings. And one of the things that mathematicians like to do is try to find patterns in vast amounts of information. And so you have an increasing number of human activities that are governed by algorithms. And an extreme case is what are known as the black box algorithms that power high-frequency online trading. And this particular quote, "We are writing things we can no longer read," refers to some of the algorithms that are used to help people make money within 1/1000th of a millisecond when you're trading stocks and bonds. And this quote comes from one of the programmers who, when he was asked, well, how does it work? He said he didn't know. He just looks for patterns. He didn't know what the patterns meant. And the interesting thing is that the kind of algorithms that are being used in this area are the same as the algorithms that are being used by companies like Amazon and by companies like Netflix to try to help you discover new things to watch and new things to read. And so Netflix and Amazon have been using a lot of the same technology to try to guess what people might want to buy. The problem is there was a fantastic mathematics experiment effectively paid for by Netflix. Netflix offered $1 million to the mathematicians who could improve the algorithms used to predict how their users might rank a movie. The problem is that the most effective algorithm they found said that the tightest match that existed amongst all their viewers was a match that said that Bergman's Joan of Arc, the worldwide wrestling SummerSlam 2004 compilation, some romantic comedy from a while back that I don't even remember what it was. It had to be you. It sort of disappeared. And a BBC adaptation of Charles Dickens's Bleak House had the most in common. Which suggests that there are limits to the filtering principle of algorithms. And in a certain sense, when it comes to books, this means we are quite literally writing things we can no longer read. Which suggests that novels break algorithms. So where are we to look, if not just algorithms? And by the way, I'm not suggesting that we eliminate all algorithms. I'm simply suggesting that we be humble about how we use them and be skeptical about how we use them. And what I suggest the opportunity lies in looking at map rather than filter. And I think book fairs like this exemplify some of what I mean by map, as do bookstores. The ability to navigate something in 3 dimensions and to use your own filtering ability to process information. After all, we do have the ability to walk into a bookstore which might have 8, 10, 25,000 titles after all, we are looking for stories, and stories are themselves the original method for condensing large amounts of information into something human-sized. Now, I grant, and this is sort of where, you know, my role as the person thinking about the future comes in, that when you think about it and when you try to talk about it, you have relatively fewer examples to work with. And so I want to point to just two examples where interesting examples where I've seen map start to work. One is a very microcosmic level, which is that there is a person who has created a website called Infinite Atlas, in which they have identified on Google Maps every single location mentioned in the American postmodern novel by David Foster Wallace, Infinite Jest, which is a sort of a spectacularly complex, dense, and highly referential work of literary fiction. This is just Boston. There are something like 12,000 points on this particular Google map. And the interesting thing is they were created by a single person. They were created by a single fan. And it points to one of the dimensions of map that I think is particularly important, which is that you leverage the power of individual passion, which is also something that tends to get left out of classic filtering, because they have a hard time measuring the intensity of engagement that a particular consumer has. They sort of flatten all cultural engagement as a consumption graph, as a graph of what you bought, not how much you care about what you bought. Do you care enough to spend 1,000 hours creating a Google map that identifies every location on the map? And then the other one, and in many ways how I'm going to present this reflects, I think, the classic limitation of two-dimensional representations of culture, as in the case of a flat web page that says, here are 5 recommendations for you. This is an effort, and it's actually about the detail that represents, I think, about 1/10 of the overall image, but I can't zoom in and zoom out. But on classic maps, of course, you can. Whether on online maps, where you can pinch on a smartphone, or just zoom in or zoom out on a Google map, but even in physical maps, where you could first look at a globe, and then open an atlas and see a country, and then flip over and see a city, and then ideally even a neighborhood. We have, as a species, an ability to zoom in and zoom out to differing degrees of granularity, differing degrees of specificity, and to be able to do that relatively comfortable. So you can zoom in to a neighborhood in Paris, come back out to the globe, go back over, zoom back in, go sideways, and that dimensionality of maps, the ability to get very specific and very abstract, is something that in the examples I feel like I gave from Oprah and Borges suggest a kind of way of navigating a beyond supply side solution for individuals to experience all the possible culture that they can enjoy, and to maintain serendipity, the ability to encounter something that you did not yet know you wanted, that is very, very difficult to achieve with algorithmic prediction. In fact, typically the way that people using algorithmic prediction try to solve that problem of always giving people the same answer is by deliberately messing up the algorithm so that it fails every so often, so that something random can come in. So it's a very sign of the weakness of algorithmic or filter-based prediction, that in order to make it work, the developers have to break it in order to make it work. Whereas map offers, I think, a much more valuable long-term direction. So basically the story so far is a world where there were some stories, mostly shared around a fireside, and very, very few books. just the books that the political or ecclesiastical authorities were willing to support. Then a world where, ironically, there were fewer stories, because there were only those stories that made sense to do in mass reproduction. In a certain sense, the perfect publishing world is a world of one book and 6 billion copies of it. From an economic standpoint, that's sort of where the economy tries to push. Oh, that's me. Hang on a sec. Sorry, let me make this stop. Then we have the world of a great many stories, more stories than you could possibly imagine, and even more books, because there's a lot of people telling the same story. And then finally, all the stories, all the possible stories. But in the world of all the possible stories, where there are as many writers as there are readers, we don't need to panic and think that there will be no readers. We just have to understand what's animating the reader, both in terms of their passion and in terms of their ability to actually navigate the culture that we have created for them, rather than to distill it down to 5 books. This is me. Tomorrow, day after tomorrow, I'm going to give a kind of a talk in which the middle slide will also say, content isn't king, culture is, but come at it from a completely different direction and try to propose a lot of more specific tools for actual publishers and actual people to use in a more practical sense. But I wanted to give a kind of a big picture version of it right now, because I thought that would be fun. And sorry. Oh yeah, so this is me. One of the things that I feel is very important when I'm privileged enough to be invited to speak in a situation like this is that I'm available to you from now off into the future. Whatever questions we can do, we do now. Whatever questions we're able to do over the next couple of days, let's do it. But feel free to email me next month or next year or next decade with ideas, questions, arguments. Tell me I'm right, tell me I'm wrong, tell me I'm half right and half wrong. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Richard. So this will be the final session here at the Business Club, and if you're still thirsty for more, we have Peter Armstrong. In a few minutes we'll be talking on LeanPub at Visa and Lean Publishing, and he will actually showcase a couple of different ways to e-publishing. And also for Richard, tomorrow Richard and Peter and Kåre Aldén from Readly will have a discussion panel on disruptive business marketing and publishing. Thank you.
To the extent there are still supply-side problems, Peter's solving them for you.
Oh, and also my talk is an idea talk more than a demo, so it's not going to be just crass commercialism. I'm going to hopefully be fun. So.